I'm looking right now at page 24 of James Boswell's The Life of Samuel Johnson. So we're right at the beginning. After a short introduction, Boswell jumps right in to telling the story of Johnson's childhood and Samuel Johnson's parents. And so right at the beginning of the book, we get a description of Samuel Johnson's father, Mr. Michael Johnson. And Boswell is going to talk about his melancholy, the mental state of Mr. Michael Johnson. And as we're going to see at the end, in addition to describing Michael Johnson, Boswell is actually describing Samuel Johnson, because what he describes in the father is something that was inherited, passed on to Samuel Johnson himself. And this is the beginning of a theme that recurs throughout the book. It's a thread that you could trace throughout the entire book, which is this theme of melancholy, this theme of depression, because Samuel Johnson was afflicted with depression his entire life. And James Boswell, who's writing the biography, is very interested in that, is very interested in describing that. So here we go, quote, "Mr. Michael Johnson was a man of a large and robust body and of a strong and active mind." And now we get a very poetic description, I think probably one of the most poetic, quote, "Yet, as in the most solid rocks, veins of unsound substance are often discovered, there was in him a mixture of that disease, the nature of which eludes the most minute inquiry, though the effects are well known to be a weariness of life, an unconcern about those things which agitate the greater part of mankind, and a general sensation of gloomy wretchedness. From him, then, his son inherited, with some other qualities, a vile melancholy, which in his too strong expression of any disturbance of the mind, quote, made him mad all his life, at least not sober," end quote. And that's a quote from Dr. Johnson himself, writing in his Tour of the Hebrides. And so that's the seed that gets planted, this vile melancholy. Just a few pages later, now I'm at page 40 in the life. And this is describing Samuel Johnson's childhood. And Boswell, when he goes through this period of time, which was before he knew Dr. Johnson, he does a really amazing job of collecting all these little anecdotes about Dr. Johnson when he was young, little excerpts of his poetry that he was writing, things like that. Quote, "The morbid melancholy which was lurking in his constitution, and to which we may ascribe those particularities, and that aversion to regular life, which at a very early period marked his character, gathered such strength in his 20th year as to afflict him in a dreadful manner. While he was at Lichfield, in the college vacation of the year 1729, he felt himself overwhelmed with a horrible hypochondria, with perpetual irritation, fretfulness, and impatience, and with a dejection, gloom, and despair which made existence misery. From this dismal malady he never afterwards was perfectly relieved, and all his labors and all his enjoyments were but temporary interruptions of its baleful influence." Now Boswell gives us a bold interjection. This is the strong voice of James Boswell inserting himself into the biography. "How wonderful, how unsearchable are the ways of God! Johnson, who was blessed with all the powers of genius and understanding in a degree far above the ordinary state of human nature, was at the same time visited with a disorder so afflictive that they who knew it by dire experience will not envy his exalted endowments." And he goes on to say that at times Dr. Johnson was so languid and inefficient that he could not distinguish the hour upon the town clock. End quote. Throughout the book, I get the distinct sense that Boswell sees himself as like this clinical observer, this like explorer into the mind of Samuel Johnson. And he's interested in interrogating and prodding and probing Johnson's psychological state. There are a few quotes throughout the book that are nothing short of heartbreaking, to be honest. There's a scene where Dr. Johnson says he would consent to have a limb amputated to restore his spirits. There's another quote from his journal, which Boswell gives us much later in the book, I guess about a third of the way or so. Johnson writing in his journal, "My mind is unsettled and my memory confused. I have of late turned my thoughts with a very useless earnestness upon past events. I have yet got no command over my thoughts. An unpleasing incident is almost certain to hinder my rest." End quote. Another tragic theme that emerges in the book is that in addition to suffering with depression, Johnson believes very strongly that indolence, that sloth, is a real moral failure. And he writes in his journals these exertions that he's using to try to overcome his indolence and his depression. And you get the sense, as an outside observer, through the conversations, through the journal entries, through the sort of forensic analysis that Boswell offers us, that there's something really painful going on inside that experience. There's a sort of inner torture as the person who values productivity and output and industry so much suffers from such a terrible depression. There are a few points in the book where Dr. Johnson talks about Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. He describes having a very deep appreciation for the book, and he at one point says it's the only book that can help him get out of bed in the morning. I have only read some short excerpts from Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, but given the recommendation of Dr. Johnson, it's something that I hope to get to, maybe after I finish this read-through. I'll visit that book. But it makes me sort of wonder, about what are those texts? What are the Anatomy of Melancholy-like texts that exist? And I would just pose it as a question, what are the books that you feel describe and capture the experience of depression? To give my answer, which is, I think, maybe a very strange answer, but there's a blog post which I will link to in the description for this video. And it was published, I remember reading it when it was published in 2013, so a little while ago. I was in college at the time. And it's from the blog called Hyperbole and a Half by Ali Brosh. And until that post, it was a pretty whimsical blog. It had this very creative, homemade art style, very beautiful in a minimalist sort of kind of way. And she wrote this like incredibly arresting and intense post about her depression. And I remember being, deeply affected by that, and it stayed with me over all these years. And for me, it's sort of like a text, which in my experience, in my limited reading scope, has really powerfully captured the experience of depression and what that means. And so just one example from that post, and it's filled with these just wonderful metaphors and really beautiful artwork. One of the examples she gives is that when you're depressed, it feels like the part of your brain that's capable of finding meaning in the world, of enjoying the world, of feeling fulfilled in some way, is dead. It's just dead. And very often when you tell other people what you're going through, when you try to explain to them as a depressed person to a non-depressed person, their knee-jerk reactions to say, oh, what can we do to help you find meaning? What are some exciting things that we could do? What's a hobby or something like that? And so she gives this analogy, which is like you tell someone, my fish are dead. I have dead fish. And they respond, oh, let's go look for your fish. Maybe where's the last place you left your fish? And her response is, the response you're giving me is for a different problem than the problem that I have. My fish are dead. They're not lost, they're dead. And that's just one example of, a post which grapples with this issue. So I posed the question to you. What texts have you read? Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy? If not, what texts do you think about when you think about depression? What would you recommend to read on this topic? That's it. Thanks for watching.